Good morning, everyone. I hope you guys all had a good weekend. I want to continue where we had talked on what we had been talking about on Friday. I want to look at the Constitution and continue our discussion of it. And I don't want to get to the Bill of Rights yet. I want to kind of pause and look at one of the great debates that was going on during the Constitutional Convention. And one of the things that I had mentioned to you was that I thought that there were several flaws in the Constitution, and I want to talk today about one of those flaws. I want to talk about slavery and how slavery fits into the American experience and what it means for us. So, if you remember, the Constitutional Convention starts in very late May of 1787, and it won't finish until September 17th of 1787. But on August 8th, right in the middle of the debates, someone brings up the issue of slavery. And it is by far the most contentious thing that these guys talk about. And so this is where I want to say, and I think we always have to be a little careful as Americans how we understand this, but we have to recognize that when these guys made the decision to allow slavery to continue in the American colonies, they were making a very important and I think very dreadful decision. But it was a decision. It wasn't one of those things that we can just dismiss and say, oh, they were men of their times and the men of their times had slaves. It doesn't work that way at all. Whenever we look at slavery in the Western tradition, it has always, since the ancient world, it has been condemned. And we know that from the time of St. Augustine all the way to the present, the church openly condemns slavery. And even the word slave comes from the word Slav, the same name that we take from the Poles and the Czechs and the Bohemians, right? That's the same name, the Slavs, because they were traditionally the people being enslaved in early medieval Europe. So it had nothing, and that's one of the things that's very interesting about the ancient world. Slavery had absolutely nothing to do with skin color, but it does in the modern world, very obviously, has a lot to do with skin color. So slavery then is reintroduced. I'm going to throw a lot of dates at you guys today. I apologize for that, but they're necessary too. Slavery begins in 1444. That's the first year that it's reintroduced into the West. And it is a very complicated thing because for the whole time that Islam had been around, Islam had been enslaving black Africans as well. They were enslaving whites too, but they were enslaving black Africans. And so this was something that the Europeans were very much against because of everything that was going on with Islam and with their struggle with Islam. But in 1444, Portugal decides to test what Islam has been doing and to do the same thing. That is, to engage in the enslavement of black Africans. And that's exactly what happens in Portugal. Portugal tries slavery on an island as an isolated experiment. And from their perspective, it works. And so they continue to do it. And pretty soon the Spanish get involved and the Dutch get involved and the English get involved. The French, not as much, but there is some enslavement with the French as well. But all of these other empires get deeply involved in what's going on in slavery. And slavery itself, economically, is really weird. Because we know, and this is how slavery works almost everywhere it's tried, slavery can be economically beneficial for the person who owns the slave, but it is never economically beneficial for a people overall. That is, wherever there's slavery, you always have a depressed economy, not at the individual level, but at the societal level. And so anytime we see slaves, we know that the economy is going to be dreadful. And one of the things, and that was very true in the American South as well, but you see this in, for example, the Soviet Union. during its existence in the 20th century, the Soviet Union only allowed about 5% of its land to be owned privately. 95% was owned by the Communist Party. And that 95% could not produce anything at all in terms of being worthy of feeding their people. It was that 5% that was free that fed almost the entire Soviet Union, along with grains from Kansas and Nebraska and elsewhere. But that's what kept the Soviet Union alive. So slavery always depresses an economy, and yet it can be very beneficial economically, right? It's always evil, but it can be beneficial to the person who actually owns the slaves. And that's one of the great paradoxes economically about it. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm confused on the word like depressed used in this art. Is that economical too? Or are you just saying every one of the countries a little bummed out?
Oh, no, well, that could be too. But no, they're all, you've got economic depression.
Okay.
Right, yeah, no problem. No problem. So you've got economic depression as well. But yes, certainly the slaves are bummed out, right? So yeah. Okay, so keep that in mind. So again, important date, 1444. And one of the theories that had been, and this is where slavery comes in economically, one of the theories of the time period, especially in the 15th century and later, was an idea that we call mercantilism. And mercantilism is really the economic theory for all empires. And what it suggests, and this is where I think it's deeply, deeply flawed, but one of the things that mercantilism suggests is that there are only a set number of resources in the world. And so if, for example, there are only, and this is an absurd argument, but just for the sake of argument, if, for example, there are 1,000 tons of gold in the world, and the Spanish are able to get hold of 500 tons of gold, then everybody else has to divide what's left. And that's mercantilism. Mercantilism doesn't allow for the process of innovation. That is, it can't explain that a gasoline engine can replace a horse-driven cart. That's not in mercantilism's understanding that resources can be invented or that they can be malleable. So, a prime example would be, you could look at a beach and a mercantilist would only see so many metric tons of sand. But Steve Jobs would see, no, this is how you make microchips right here. And there's that innovative process. And so that's where mercantilism really fails. But the reason I bring it up now in this theory is it's always attempting by the nation state. So whether it's Spain or France or the Netherlands or England, Portugal, whatever it may be, it always posits that the role of the nation state is to go out and secure as many resources as possible in order to prevent other nation states from securing those very same resources. And in this theory, labor becomes a constant. And so the fear is, well, if the Spanish have this many people who can labor, then the English need to have this many people as well, and therefore it's acceptable to enter into slavery because for the good of the nation state, we need to have slavery as well because we too need the resource of labor. We need this as a major component for our economy. So it's really by just accident that slavery in the modern world becomes about color. Remember, that was what the Muslims had been doing, and so that's what the Europeans engage in as well. But again, slavery typically had nothing to do with color in its history. In fact, it was quite anti-color in the sense that anybody could be enslaved. Well, my point is, everybody at the founding convention, everybody at the Constitutional Convention, without question, knew that slavery was wrong and that it depressed an economy. So they knew that it was morally wrong, right? So they were bummed. They knew that it was morally wrong, but they also knew that it was economically a disaster as well. And yet, remember, those people who own slaves often see the benefit of it economically as opposed to a people who own slaves. And so South Carolina and Georgia just fight like the dickens to keep slavery along with the U.S. Constitution. Right? That's their demand. They basically say, either you keep slavery or we walk. And that was the threat. And the Americans went along with it. The other 11 colonies, the other 11 states said, all right, we don't want to lose Georgia and South Carolina because that would be disastrous, and therefore we'll accept slavery. But I want you guys to see this is a deal with the devil. This is not something, oh, they had to do this. They most certainly did not have to do this. And they chose the wrong thing. They chose the immoral. They chose the unethical for the sake of the efficient. And that's something that all of you in your lifetime, being voters, you're going to have to weigh those things. Is it ever justified to use the human person as a means to an end? I would, sitting here at my desk, age 58, and being a professor all my life, never having been in the political realm, I would say absolutely it is never, ever, under any circumstances, okay to misuse a person. But I'm not in the reality of that chair either. I'm in a different kind of existence. So I can sit here and preach, that was terrible, that was evil, but I wasn't there on the ground for it either. So that makes it a complicated issue. Yeah.
I'm just curious, what evidence do we have that the writers of the Constitution definitely knew that slavery was bad for the economy? Did they talk about it?
Oh yeah, I'll read here passages in just a second. Yeah, I'll give you all the evidence you want. Yeah, where they debated. So remember, in the Constitutional Convention, they bring this up on August 8th. So pretty late into the convention itself, very late. Okay, here we go. What do we see? So August 8th, the introduction of slavery. And here is what we get. This is Rufus King. And I want you guys I'd like you to write his name down. He's not one of the more important founders, but you'll see later on in the semester he plays a key role in American history. So a guy named Rufus King, just K-I-N-G. He is a delegate from New England. He'll end up in New York, but as a young man, he's a delegate from New England, adamantly anti-slavery. And he stands up and he says, the admission of slaves would be the most grating circumstance to my mind. And it would be, for the most part, for almost all the people of America. There must be strenuous opposition to all of this. Why? Well, Roger Sherman of Connecticut says the slave trade is iniquitous, right? It's evil. It's iniquitous. It's of the devil in some way. And then Gouverneur Morris says, and he's also, so we get three adamantly anti-slavery guys right in a row. Gouverneur Morris says, everything will depend upon this point of whether we allow slavery in or not. I would never consent in upholding domestic slavery. It is a nefarious institution. It is the curse of heaven on the states where it prevails. Compare the free regions of the middle states, which are rich and noble in cultivation and have prosperity and happiness. Compare them with the misery and poverty which overspreads the barren wastes of the states having slaves. Right? Is that enough evidence? I mean, there we have it. They recognize. So, number one, it's nefarious. And they're stating this openly. It's not like the slaveholders can't hear them. Remember, they're in a room this size with 56 guys arguing. So they are all dealing with this. And several people bring up, look, this thing is nefarious, it's iniquitous, and it's terrible for the economy. So why would we want this thing at all? And again, there's that element where the individual slave owners say, no, this thing is they never say it's good, but they say it's necessary. The idea that slavery is good won't develop until the late 1820s, what's called the positive good argument. And then in the 1820s, you'll have arguments. No, this is really good. We've taken these people from a backwards area of Africa and we've civilized and Christianized them. Therefore, slavery is a positive good. And I bring this up because I'm not trying to be too controversial, but I want you guys to realize this. Think about abortion, which is a very, very similar kind of issue for Americans. It's almost identical to slavery. And when abortion first becomes legal in America in the early 1970s, and of course I was a tiny kid when it became legal. I was 5, I think. So I don't really remember all of this. I've only read about it. But certainly when it became legal, it was one of those things that everybody was embarrassed about. It's like even people who supported abortion were like, oh yeah, it's a terrible thing, but we need to have it. Otherwise, we're going to have back alley abortions and all this problem. And so for just health care, we need to have it. And then it was one of those things where nobody ever talked about. For example, in my hometown, we had one doctor who did abortions in Kansas, of all places, small town Kansas. We had a doctor who did abortions. Nobody talked about him. He was a person who was not welcomed at any social event in town. They just ignored him totally. He had no position at all. But then look what's happening now. You see these protests of people in Minnesota and people who counter-protest the pro-life movement, and they're wearing T-shirts that say, I proudly had an abortion. That's that whole trajectory where it was supposed to be just very rare and medical only and something that was utterly embarrassing now becomes something that people proclaim proudly they've done. That's exactly what happens with slavery. Slavery is that issue that is so embarrassing for people at the time of the convention. They're so embarrassed by it. And they don't even talk about it. And if you guys have ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin, remember the slave trader who's so utterly important to the story is a person non grata. Nobody will talk to him. He will not be invited to any social events. They hate him, and yet they need him at the same time. That's exactly what's going on with slavery and with abortion. It goes from being embarrassing to being something we celebrate. And that's a decadent moment whenever you celebrate an evil. That is a very decadent moment. So that's what's happening here as well as we move into the 1820s. Okay, so this is still Gouverneur Morris. He kind of yells at one point. He says, I want to know what's going on here. How will we ever count slaves in representation? Are they men or are they property? Right? And he's anti-slavery, so he doesn't want them to be just as property. And that's the debate. And we see these guys for about 5 days just yelling at each other at the Constitutional Convention, not our image of the great demigod statesmen who are sitting there giving us the greatest constitution in the world, but guys who are brutally fighting with each other over the issue of slavery. And in the middle of it, we get this voice of reason that I want to just read to you, because here's John Dickinson. You guys remember Dickinson, the author of the Articles of Confederation. Dickinson is one of the 2 most important men at the Constitutional Convention. So the 2 most important men by far at the Constitutional Convention are James Madison, who's very young at this point, and then also John Dickinson. And the reason these 2 guys are so important is because James Madison will always take the side of conservatism. I'm sorry, scratch that. James Madison will always take the side of innovation. He is always wanting to try something new. I've got this great idea, everybody, and I want us all to go along with it. Right? That's Madison. I have this great thing that no one has ever tried before. Let's try it. And every time Madison says that, Dickinson gets up and he says, no, you have to show me where it has been tried in history. If it has never been tried in history, we are not doing it here. The Constitution is not an experiment. It is a governing document. And therefore, our only means of evidence is the evidence that we get from history itself. History is our laboratory. So we either understand that it's happened before or we don't do it again. And those become the two great figures of the Constitutional Convention because they're always playing off each other, one wanting to innovate, the other wanting to conserve. And so it takes two forces, two headstrong men like that, to come out with a constitution. And remember, as we've talked about, with something like the presidency, that is an innovation that had never been tried before in any other system of government. The idea that you could have an elective monarch rather than a permanent monarch, but an elected one. We know that it comes from the Germans, from the Germanic tribes, but even they called it chief, not president. And so that idea is transferred here. The chief of the Germans becomes the president of the Americans. So there's a deep relationship there, but it's not mechanistic in the way ours is more mechanistic than what the Germans had done. So on August 13th, all right, we're just several days into the debate, Dickinson gives what many regard to be the most famous speech in all of the constitutional debates. And he gives this on August 13th. So we remember it as his August 13th speech, but it's in the middle of the debate on slavery. And remember, emotions are running very high. And you've got adamantly pro-slavery people and adamantly anti-slavery people, and they cannot resolve their differences at all. And here's Dickinson. He just pauses and he asks everybody to calm down. And he says, experience must be our only guide, for reason may mislead us. It was not reason that discovered the singular and admirable mechanism of the English Constitution. It was not reason that discovered or ever could have discovered the odd and the eye of those who were governed by reason. For example, that absurd mode of trial by jury. Accidents produced these discoveries, and experience gave them sanction. Let that then be our only guide. And I hope you guys see what he's doing here. Dickinson is not only calming everyone down and saying, look, let's talk about this, let's be reasonable about this in the best sense, let's be reasonable. But by giving us the example of the common law, he's also undermining slavery, because slavery was always forbidden in the common law. The common law cannot allow slavery because you can't have a society based on the common if people are enslaved. And so common law was automatically anti-slavery. So Dickinson is making his point here. Let's calm down, but at the same time, let's also recognize that slavery is inherently evil. Well, the convention then really finishes the debate on about August 21st. They finish the debate about slavery. They're not totally done. There's still a few things to deal with. And I'll read one of the later speeches, but we pretty much have solidified the two sides as of August 21st. And Rutledge, you don't need to write his name down, but Rutledge from one of the southern states stands up and he says this. He says, religion and humanity have nothing to do with politics. Interest alone is the governing principle of nations. That becomes his argument. So we don't think about, is it right or wrong? We think only, does it work or not? And that becomes the answer, I think very unfortunately, but that becomes the answer for the convention. That is, it is in the interest of the country to keep South Carolina and Georgia, and therefore we will allow slavery in all of this. But we still get one really rousing anti-slavery speech. And this speech is amazing, and I do want you guys to know his name, who gives this. It is the largest slaveholder in America who gives the most anti-slavery speech at the convention, a guy by the name of George Mason. So George Mason comes up and he says, I can't vote for this Constitution now because it allows slavery, because this was his means by which to end his slaveholding. And that was what he was going to do, and he wanted everybody to follow suit, that they would all get rid of their slaves at once, and it would be this great moment. So he says, this is Colonel Mason, this infernal traffic originated only with the avarice of British merchants, and the British government constantly checked the attempts of Virginia to put a stop to it. The evil of having slaves is experienced very much during the late war. Had the slaves there been treated as they might have been by the enemy, they would have proved dangerous instruments in their hands. But their folly dealt by the slaves as it did with the Tories. Should we not give remembrance to the great insurrection of slaves in Greece and in Sicily? Should we not recognize that Cromwell wanted to free all of our slaves to kill us all? What do we need to understand? South Carolina and Georgia can be fine and have liberty to import as we want, but we will not choose that. Let me remind you, and again, this gets back to our evidence that you were asking for a moment ago, slavery always discourages the arts and manufacturing. The poor despise labor when performed by slaves. It prevents the immigration of those who would really strengthen a country. And every master of slaves becomes a petty tyrant, not fit for the liberty of a free people. They bring the judgment of heaven upon our nation. And nations will be rewarded, if not in this world, then they will be punished in the next. But this is inevitable, and therefore I beg us not to increase the view of slavery in this country. So again, these are knockdown, drag-out fights that these guys are taking on here and trying to put this in perspective. Okay, so you guys, yes, please.
So George Mason, did he end up freeing
Yeah,
slaves?
he did. But it was, so part of the problem in a place like Virginia, it was actually illegal to free your slaves. And so there were all kinds of laws in place that refused what they would call manumission, to let go of a slave. And that was not atypical in the South. There were a lot of places that did that. And so just from a property standpoint, he wasn't really able to, but they got around it. The most famous getting around this was George Washington. George Washington freed all of his slaves. And not only that, he took what income he had at his death and he separated it. It was divided evenly among all of his slaves. So they were all given property and they were all given an education. And those slaves, so Washington dies in 1799, but the estate is still paying out to his former slaves as of 1832. So for 33 years, they're being taken care of, even after Washington's death. Mason does something very similar. Jefferson does not. And that's always been a kind of problem where we think about where's Jefferson fit in all of this. Jefferson manumitted his wife's sister, a woman by the name of Sally Hemings, and he manumitted her children, but those were the only slaves that he freed overall. So his wife's half-sister, and then, so pretty amazing to think about that. But yeah, that's a huge part of the story as well. Okay, let me now give you the other side of it and try and defend the founders a little bit on what's going on here. I'm not going to defend slavery, right? That's just, there's no defense for it. It's wrong. It's evil. It's immoral. It's unethical. There's just no defense for it. But historically, we can try and figure out why did they allow it to keep going. So the Constitution allows 3 parts to deal with slavery, though the word slave, very importantly, never once appears in the Constitution. That was one thing the anti-slavery forces were able to get across, that we will not use this word at all. They're called unfree persons or property or 3/5 persons, but they're not called slaves. They didn't want that word in a libertarian document, so they let it go. But here are the 3 compromises. Number 1, when dealing with population, every slave in the South would be regarded as 3/5 of a person. And this is just called the 3/5 clause. So you can imagine a white person is regarded as 1, a black person is regarded as 3/5. So more than a half, but not at 3/4 yet either, and certainly not a full person. So above property in the sense of above livestock, but not human at all. So 3/5, and that's going to matter because it means that when you're tallying votes for the House of Representatives, if you've got 1,000 slaves, then you can count 3/5 of them for the population of your voting. And I think this is utterly unfair. I mean, first of all, it's crazy ethically and morally, but it's utterly unfair to the North. It gives the advantage to the South because they can count their property as part and parcel of their population.
And this is still only like men, right? So like
No, all slaves, so men and women are counted, yeah, and children.
for like voting.
Well, they don't get to vote, but they get to count for whites voting. So if we could count, if you've got 1,000 slaves and you can count 3/5 of them for your population, that may give you an extra representative in Congress.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, okay, good. Does that make sense for when the blacks don't get to vote? No, not at all. But others get to vote, and so it gives a huge advantage to the South because they get to count these people that Northerners can't count. Yeah.
I actually don't know this. If there were any black men in the North that were not slaves, could they vote?
Oh, definitely.
Oh.
Places like Philadelphia and Boston, black men can vote.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and it just depended on the community. But among the Quakers especially, yeah, there was not a problem with blacks voting. So yeah, you had that in the North, definitely. Okay, number 2, very importantly, there was what was called the fugitive, and I'm just going to put its initials down there, called the Fugitive Slave Clause. And what the Fugitive Slave Clause said was that any time a slave escaped into a free area, it was the duty of that free people to return the slave to slavery. Now, that's heinous, right? So you can imagine, let's say that we're in Ohio and a black slave escaped from Kentucky. By the U.S. Constitution, we are determined that we have to return that slave to Kentucky. Now, here's the really interesting thing about this Fugitive Slave Clause. It is never enforced until 1850. So it's almost entirely ignored. It's on paper. It says it right there in the Constitution, but almost everybody ignores it. So, and then in 1850, there's a law passed called the Fugitive Slave Law that now ratifies what had been in the Constitution. But notice we go from 1787 all the way up until 1850 without enforcing this at all. And then there is the ban on the importation of slaves. And that ban, according to the Constitution, can happen as early as January 1st, 1808. So notice what this does. It gives 20 years to import blacks into America. It gives 20 free years. And then Thomas Jefferson very intentionally got through Congress a bill that ended slavery the first moment it could be ended. That is, ends the slave trade, not slavery, but the slave trade ends at January 1st of 1808. Okay, so let me put this in perspective, and again, maybe defend the founders a little bit on what they were trying to do. The very first Africans, and I'm going to throw a lot of dates at you guys, so stop me if I'm going too fast or if you're not following me, but I do want you to know these dates. Okay, the very first black Africans arrive on American soil. They arrive at Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. So 1619 is the first year there are ever black Africans on American soil. Now, keep this in mind, right? We've got this huge slave trade going on between Africa and America and the Americas. And it's very, very complicated. It's not just white on black. It's white on black and black on black as well in the way that slavery works. So because of the disease factor, Europeans cannot go into Africa. Europeans, and you guys think about this today, let's say you go take a trip to Liberia or you take a trip to any African country. Think about all the shots you have to get. You just have to get shot after shot after shot. Well, none of those shots existed in the 15th century. And so Africans were able to keep whites out because whites could not handle the disease factor of Africa. But what they could do was they could take over islands off the coast of Africa. And so Europeans would take over islands off the coast of Africa. They would then ally themselves with coastal African tribes. Those African tribes would go into the interior, capture their enemies, bring them back, and sell them to the Europeans. So this is not just white on black, it's black on black as well. And so you've got a real division within Africa in which Africans are enslaving other Africans. So it's a very, very complicated picture. The other thing I'll say about this, which I think is important, is of all the Africans that are imported to the Americas, only 5% ever come to what will be the United States. 95% go to Brazil and the Caribbean. So that's where the real slave trade is happening. America is on the margins, just 5% total. So most people are going to Brazil or to the Caribbean. So keep that in mind. All right, here's where it gets really complicated. So these Africans are brought on a Dutch ship. They could not be sold in the Caribbean. And so these Dutch sailors come on up to Jamestown and they say, look, we've got these several, like 3 or 4 black guys that we want to sell you. And the Virginians buy them. But here again is where it gets really complicated. They are not slaves. They are prisoners of war. They've been taken against their will, and they've been sold. But they've been sold as what were called indentured servants, not slaves. And there is a difference. So they are sold as indentured servants. And what that means, now this is totally unfair, but it's not slavery. What this means is they will have to work for 7 years to pay off their passage to America, even though they're captured and they're totally not wanting to come to America. The fiction is they have to pay off their passage. They have to work for 7 years. And at the end of that 7 years, they are freed. It's at the Jubilee, right? Not only are they freed, but they're paid back wages and they're given land, they're given property. So from 1619 all the way up until 1669, there is no slavery in America in the way that we define it, where someone is permanently owned by another person. That does not exist. Instead, what we have are forced indentured servants. It's not great, but it's not horrible either. And just imagine, on the eve of the American Civil War, there are 250,000 free blacks in the South. Hey, you guys ever wondered where they came from? They're these guys who were brought over for 50 years and freed at the end of it. So you had a thriving free black community in the South. And then something happens that we just don't understand. Historians have gone back and forth over this. Our best historians have tried to deal with this. We have no answer for it. Suddenly in 1669, and that's the first year, suddenly in 1669, Southern whites throughout all of the South just stopped freeing their black servants at the end of 7 years. We know it from court records. We know it from probate records. We don't know what happened. All we know is that suddenly what we call slavery becomes real. Very, very real in America. Deeply, tragically real in America. And that will last all the way up until 1761. Okay, again, it's complicated. So we have slavery now, real slavery, horrible, terrible slavery. We have it starting in 1669, and it goes all the way up until 1761. And then something crazy happens that, again, we're not totally sure why, we just know it did. From 1761 until 1793, we don't know how many, but our estimates are that anywhere from 1 out of every 3 to 1 out of every 2 slaves is just freed. Americans just free them. Either 33% of them or 50% of them. You guys think about that. Be historians for a moment. What happened? What's going on? 1761 to 1793. Why would slavery just suddenly decline? Yeah.
Maybe with Enlightenment ideals and the revolutions happening in this period, so it's like very real, these concepts of liberty and equality.
Yeah, you can't say all men are created equal and enslave somebody. You can't do it. It's a total contradiction. And so wherever there's the revolutionary spirit, and the revolutionary spirit starts in February of 1761, wherever there's the revolutionary spirit, people are freeing their slaves. They're just doing it. Even sometimes against the law, they're doing it. And so that's amazing. So here's where, okay, we have to be really, really careful about the founding. When's the Constitutional Convention? I just read you guys those debates. When was it? It's in this time period, right? It's in this time period. So if we allow, let's say that we go ahead and allow South Carolina and Georgia to keep their slaves, well, what do we see in the world? What does it look like at that moment? Looks like slavery is about done. This is over. God, nature, whomever has determined this thing is done. So every one of the founding fathers who voted in favor of slavery was doing so because they believed it was about dead as an institution. So there again, and that's why I wanted to give you guys both sides of the story. We know what they chose was to choose an evil, but when they chose that evil, they thought that evil had a pretty serious time limit. And so when they pass, if we can give them this excuse, when they pass these 3 compromises in the Constitution, they're not compromises that extend slavery. They're compromises that allow the death of slavery. They're easing the death of slavery. Does that make sense for everyone? Why this matters? So, okay. And then something totally crazy happens in 1793. Something that no one could have predicted. there's this really great guy, just heart and soul, great guy by the name of Eli Whitney, who's a student at Yale, and he hates slavery, and he hates racial discrimination, and he's a devout evangelical Christian. And so he goes down to the South as part of a mission, right? Imagine you get spring break and you go on a mission trip. He goes to the South because he wants to see what the life of a black slave is like. He's horrified. Here are these guys picking cotton, and they're doing so for 12 hours a day without a break. And what do we find? Cotton, I don't know if you guys have ever picked cotton. It's extremely labor intensive. Cotton grows in what's called a boll, B-O-L-L, same thing that if you guys smoke a pipe, that's a boll. And so you've got this boll, and it's got these really intricate, complicated, hard leaves around it. And what you have to do is break off the leaves and pull the cotton out. And cotton's not white. It's dyed white for us, but it's a kind of yellowish brown, and it's got thousands of seeds in it. And so when you break open the boll, you have to pull out seed by seed. And what that means is in hot, humid weather, a good slave could pick about 1 pound of cotton a day. That was it. Just about 1 pound of cotton. Well, Eli Whitney's a genius. And what he does is he creates a machine called a gin. And in this machine, he has rotating teeth. And what these rotating teeth do is they take the boll of cotton, they crack it, they break it, they twist it, so that almost all the seeds come right out in the twisting. And therefore, with his machine, an average person can produce 1,000 pounds of cotton a day. It's the greatest labor-saving device in our history to go from 1 pound of cotton a day to 1,000. Why does Eli Whitney do this? He does this because he feels sorry for black slaves, and he wants to ease their pain. What did he just unwittingly do? He just made cotton production extremely profitable everywhere. And so rather than it decreasing slaves, slavery in the next 2 decades increases by 400%. Massive increase of slavery because he's made it economically viable. The absolute last thing Eli Whitney ever wanted to do. And that was the result of this. So when we talk about Civil War slavery, when we think about the horrors of the South, the rapes, the brutality, the whippings, the killings, the murders, everything you can think of that goes wrong with slavery, it all dates to 1793. It all dates to that year. So that's when we're going to see the real brutality of this. You guys get unintended consequences, right? This is crazy. This is crazy, exactly the opposite of what Eli Whitney wanted, but it had that effect. Yeah.
So if they need less labor with the cotton gin, why do they have more slaves?
Because they can now expand into more land. So they can keep moving west, and land that would have only been marginally good for cotton now becomes profitable. And so it means huge expansion into the Western territories for the South. Now, I want you guys to keep this in mind, and we'll talk about this more later. Slavery, and think about this, where do all the slaves come from? They all come from the hot, humid parts of Africa. There are no slaves from the desert, no slaves from the whatever they call it, the veldt. They're all from the hot, humid areas. Where does slavery only work in America? Only in the hot, humid areas. You take slavery to a place like Iowa, it fails miserably. You take it to a place like the swamps of Virginia, it succeeds. So slavery only works where there's humidity and only works where there's mugginess. And that we can talk more about why that's the case, but just keep that in mind. Okay, guys, anything else? All right. Thanks, everybody. Sorry it was kind of a depressing day, but important stuff to talk about. So, good. I'll see you guys. I'm actually, I'm gone on Wednesday. My wife's going to take your class again on Wednesday, but I'll be here on Friday for your test, right? So, the poor lot in life, I have to travel to Florida tomorrow. So I'm sure you guys all feel sorry for me, but yeah, bummer.